The war had been over for nearly a decade. The banners were gone, the drums were silent, and the frontier lay broken and dry. But one winter evening, a column of Union cavalry rode into a dying town. Their uniforms were torn, their flags faded, yet they marched in perfect step, faces pale, eyes hollow, voices silent. The townsfolk asked the same question that still lingers today. Who were those soldiers? And why did they never leave? Because in the town of Coldwater, the war didn't end. It only changed sides. Where are you tuning in from tonight? Drop it in the comments below. I always like seeing where these stories are reaching. And if you want more tales like this one, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. The desert road ran quiet that evening. The sky was burning down into the kind of red that makes men close shutters and women whisper prayers. Dust clung to the horizon, and the town of Coldwater sat in silence, bracing for another night of hunger. It was 1873. The war had been over nearly a decade, but out here, peace never reached. The wells were dry, the cattle were lean, the men too tired to guard the streets anymore. Families thought about leaving, but there was nowhere left to go. That was when the riders appeared. They came at dusk, 20 strong, moving in perfect formation. Dust rose from their boots and hooves, but not a word passed between them. Their blue Union uniforms were ragged, sleeves torn, flags faded, but their discipline was flawless. Rifles glinted in the dying light, and their pale faces were unreadable beneath shadowed hats. A boy was the first to spot them. He stood barefoot in the dirt street, frozen, staring as the line of cavalrymen trotted closer, their silence louder than any battle march. "Mama," he whispered, "the soldiers are here." Doors opened, shutters creaked, the town gathered at porches and wind. Dows, unsure whether to cheer or run. The war was long over, yet here came a Union regiment as if the drums had never ceased. At their head rode a man taller than the rest. His coat was longer, his hat brim lower, his horse blacker than night, and on his hands he wore black leather gloves. Not once did he lift them to tip his hat, not once did he wave. His eyes, though hidden beneath shadow, seemed to sweep the town all the same, measuring every soul that dared look back. The riders halted at the center of Main Street. Dust swirled around them, settling in the silence. Then, at last, the commander spoke. His voice was smooth but cold, like creek water pulled from stone. "Good evening," he said. "I am Captain Silas Graves. These men are my command. We fought once to keep this Union whole. We fight still." No one answered. The war was over. Everyone knew it. But Captain Graves didn't speak like a man uncertain. He spoke like the war had never ended. "We will give you order," he continued. "We will guard your streets, protect your homes, and drive away whatever raiders prowl the desert. All we ask in return," his words lingered in the air, deliberate, heavy, "is food, shelter, and silence." The townsfolk shifted. A rancher muttered under his breath, "We ain't got food enough for our own." His wife hushed him, eyes locked on the pale soldiers whose faces didn't so much as twitch. The captain dismounted slow, boots crunching on dirt. He moved like a man certain of his strength, certain no one would challenge him. When his gloved hand brushed his coat aside, every eye noticed the revolver at his hip, polished, gleaming, ready. He looked at the people gathered, at mothers holding children close, at the old men gripping canes, and at the weary sheriff who had no deputies left to back him. "You are tired," Captain Graves said calmly. "We are not. You are hunted. We are no. You are dying. We are not." His words carried strange weight, like scripture written in iron. "Let us march for you. Let us bleed for you. In return, give us what we ask, and this town will live." The sheriff stepped forward, hat in hand, voice thin. "War's been over near 10 years, Captain. Ain't no Confederates left to fight, only dust and hunger out here." The captain's head tilted just so, as though he'd heard a child speak out of turn. "Dust and hunger are enemies too," he replied. "They can be beaten. With discipline, with strength, with loyalty. The men behind him sat motionless, rifles balanced, eyes forward. They hadn't blinked once, not a cough, not a twitch, only stillness, like statues carved from bone and cloth. The sheriff licked his lips. If you can keep raiders off our backs, if you can guard the wells and cattle. He hesitated, looking at the hollow eyes staring back at him. Then maybe we got a deal. The captain's lips curled. Not a smile, not quite, more like the hint of one. Good, he said simply. He raised one gloved hand and gave a signal. The soldiers moved all at once, boots hitting dirt together. They dismounted in unison, rifles slung in perfect rhythm. Not one broke step, not one looked away from the captain. The townsfolk stepped back instinctively, uneasy, though no threat had been spoken. The riders simply stood there, pale faces empty, waiting for orders like the war drums still beat in their ears. Captain Graves looked around Main Street once more. His eyes lingered on the church, the saloon, the jailhouse. His gaze seemed to weigh them, to judge them, to measure how long they would stand. Then he said, "We will drill at dusk. We will march at night. You will hear us. You will not watch us." The torchlight caught his eyes then, just for a moment. A reflection too sharp, too bright, like glass catching fire. No one spoke. No one moved. The riders were here. And for the first time in years, Coldwater felt the weight of soldiers in its streets. Only this war was different. This war was wrong. The next morning, Coldwater woke to the sound of boots. Not one pair, not a few, dozens, striking dirt in perfect rhythm. The town stirred from its beds, stepping onto porches to see the Union cavalry lined in the street, rifles balanced, shoulders square, eyes forward. Captain Silas Graves stood at their head, still gloved, still unreadable. The sheriff approached cautiously, tugging his hat. "Didn't reckon you'd start so early," Graves answered without looking at him. "A soldier wakes when the sun does. Discipline feeds survival." He barked a wordless command. In an instant, the soldiers broke formation into drills. They moved fast, too fast, rifles snapping, boots slamming, dust rising. Their movements were flawless, no hesitation, no misstep. Even veteran eyes in town knew no regiment ever moved this perfect. The sheriff swallowed hard. By noon, the town saw the soldiers everywhere. 2 stood at the well, watching as women drew buckets. Another pair walked the cattle pens, faces pale in the sun. 2 more leaned on rifles at the edge of town, scanning the horizon. They never spoke, never joked, just stood, silent, waiting. And when the townsfolk offered them bread or water, the soldiers only shook their heads. "They don't eat?" a rancher whispered. "Maybe they're saving it," his wife murmured. But her eyes lingered on their faces, too sharp, too bloodless, too still. That evening, the captain gathered the town in front of the church. Lanterns lit the dusty street, casting long shadows across the cavalry's pale faces. "You want safety," Graves said, voice calm, steady. "We provide it. But soldiers do not march on dust. Soldiers must be fed." The blacksmith crossed his arms. "We ain't got enough for ourselves." The captain's eyes flicked to him, and the big man lowered his gaze almost without meaning to. "You have enough," Graves said. "You will give." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. An old armor raised his voice, shaky. "And how long you plan on staying, Captain? War's done. Ain't no fight left out here." Graves tilted his head. "War is never done. There is always an enemy." The farmer frowned. "What enemy?" The captain's pale eyes swept the crowd, then lingered on the horizon where the desert stretched endless. "Hunger. Thirst. The chaos that takes men when order breaks. We fight it. We fight for you." A nervous woman clutched her child close. "And if we can't give enough?" Graves paused. His gloved hand tightened on his belt. "Then we take what we must." The crowd went silent. The soldiers behind him stood motionless, rifles gleaming in the lantern light, as if waiting for the town to argue. No one did. Finally, the sheriff cleared his throat. "We'll provide what we can." The captain nodded once. "Good. Then this town will live." That night, the drills began again. The bugle call split the silence at dusk, and boots thundered down Main Street. The cavalry marched in unison, rifles clattering, their pale faces blank in the torchlight. The townsfolk lay in their beds, listening. The pounding went on for hours, steady as war drums. Children cried, mothers hushed them, and fathers stared at the ceiling, fists clenched. By midnight, the sound finally stopped, but none who heard it would ever forget. The next morning, townsfolk found strange things. Chickens gone, feathers scattered. A goat dead in its pen, body drained dry. A horse found lying stiff by the creek, no wound, no blood. The ranchers muttered about wolves, about raiders, but deep down, no one believed it. Because the soldiers had patrolled the night, because no wolf drained blood like a man's hand could. At the saloon, the barkeep whispered what everyone was thinking. They drill at night. Don't eat. Don't drink. Don't sleep. What are they? The sheriff hushed him, glancing toward the street where two pale soldiers stood silent at the corner. Their protection, he muttered. Don't question it. But his ice shook, and the whole town felt it. Protection had its price, and Coldwater had already begun to pay. For a week, Coldwater lived under the watch of its new soldiers. At first, some townsfolk welcomed the change. Raiders hadn't come near. Cattle still stood in the pens. The sheriff even admitted the town felt safer than it had in years. But the safety came with a silence that felt worse than danger. The cavalry patrolled the streets without speaking. Pale faces, blank eyes, rifles held stiff. They didn't laugh, didn't cough, didn't spit. The only sound was the steady rhythm of boots when they moved together, and every night, just as the last sun bled behind the desert, the bugle called. Then came the drills, boots pounding, rifles clattering, commands barked in voices that weren't words so much as growls. The town lay awake listening as the regiment marched for hours, dust rising through the moonlight. Children cried into pillows, parents whispered prayers, and yet no one dared go outside to watch. Not after what the widow claimed she saw. Her name was Martha Greeley. She lived near the creek, in a one-room house with a lamp always burning in the window. One night she swore Captain Graves himself stood outside her glass. Pale face, cold eyes, a shadow that seemed too tall for a man. She told the sheriff the next morning. Told anyone who'd listen. Most said she was seeing things. Grief, they claimed. Her husband had died in the war, and loneliness had eaten her mind. But the next day, her lamp stayed dark, and Martha was gone. Inside her cabin, the bed was overturned, the walls splattered with something dark. No tracks led away from the house, no signs of struggle but claw marks in the wood. The sheriff said, "Wolves." The cavalry stood in silence behind him, pale faces unreadable. But wolves didn't leave claw marks shaped like hands. A few days later, it was Thomas B. Aird, the farmer. Folks saw him argue with a cavalryman at the well. He'd accused the soldier of scaring his daughter. His voice was loud, his words sharp. The pale soldier said nothing, just gripped the edge of the bucket until the wood cracked under his hand. That night, Thomas never came home. His wife begged the cavalry to search. They rode into the desert, torches in hand, and returned at dawn with empty saddles. "Riders from the south," Captain Graves explained. "They took him. We will protect you from more raids." But his wife found Thomas's hat by the church steps, soaked dark at the brim. The cavalry said nothing. Fear spread through Coldwater like sickness. Neighbors whispered at doors. Mothers clutched children tighter. Men kept rifles under their beds but dared not point them toward the pale riders who walked their streets. At the saloon, the barkeep leaned across the bar, voice shaking. "They're taking people. First Martha, now Thomas, and the sheriff. He don't even question it." The blacksmith grunted. "You say that out loud. You'll be next." The barkeep's hands trembled. You think they can hear us now? The blacksmith's eyes flicked to the corner, where two soldiers stood silent in the doorway, rifles in hand, eyes cold and empty. Neither man spoke another word. That night, the drills sounded louder than ever. The bugle call tore through the dark. Boots thundered like war drums. The townsfolk lay in their beds, listening, staring at their ceilings as the noise went on and on. And through it all, they whispered the question no one dared speak in daylight. What war were these soldiers still fighting? Coldwater was changing. By now, no one laughed in the saloon. No one lingered on porches. Even children had learned to stay quiet when the cavalry marched past. The town was alive, but it no longer felt like living. It felt like waiting. And then the widow spoke. Her name was Abigail Holt. She lived in a clapboard house at the edge of town, where the desert met the road. She'd lost her husband in the war, her Tibayan, sons to fever. Folks pitied her. She was a lonely woman, given to long talks with herself. But when she walked into the church one Sunday, pale and trembling, even the preacher knew her words weren't just grief. She said the captain had come to her window. Not knocked, not spoken, just stood. She swore she woke to the sound of boots outside her wall. When she lifted the curtain, she saw Captain Graves staring through the glass, hat low, coat long, pale face glowing faint in the moonlight. His eyes, she said, burned red in the dark, and then he smiled. She swore she saw teeth too long for a man's mouth, sharp, gleaming. Abigail slammed the shutters and prayed till dawn. When she opened them again, there was nothing but dust. The preacher urged calm, said she'd dreamed it, said grief played tricks, but Abigail wouldn't stop. She told it in the church, at the well, in the street. She pointed to her window pane, where the glass was cracked in a circle, as though a face had pressed against it. The soldiers never looked her way, but folks noticed they passed her house more often now, boots crunching slow, rifles glinting, watching, waiting. Abigail stood in the street one evening and shouted at them, "You ain't soldiers? You're demons wearing uniforms." Mothers dragged children inside. Men muttered prayers. The sheriff begged her to stop, but she wouldn't. 2 nights later, her lamp went out. The next morning, her door hung open. Her bed was overturned. The walls streaked dark. On the floor lay her Bible, torn in half. Abigail Holt was gone. The sheriff gathered men to search. They found nothing but hoof prints circling her house, pressed deep in the dust. The prints were too sharp, too perfect, as if made by horses that weren't alive at all. By now, fear had turned to silence. No one spoke of Abigail in the saloon. No one mentioned the glass crack at her window, mothers too. Elderly children not to ask. And the preacher, who had once called her a grieving widow, spoke no more on the matter. At night the bugle sounded and boots thundered. The regiment drilled as always, shadows long in the moonlight, rifles clattering in perfect rhythm. But now, every man, woman, and child who lay awake in their beds imagined Abigail's face at their own window. The next Sunday, the church was half empty. The preacher's sermon faltered, and outside, the cavalry stood silent at the corners, watching, listening. Coldwater had learned its lesson. The soldiers didn't need threats. The soldiers didn't need words. One widow's warning was enough, and the rest of the town chose silence. By midsummer, Coldwater had learned how to live under the cavalry. Don't ask questions. Don't walk after dark. Don't watch the drills. And never, ever speak of the missing. The town obeyed. People nodded at the pale soldiers on their corners, kept their eyes low, and offered bread and water at dusk, even though the soldiers never touched it. Fear had become routine, but fear always breaks somewhere. And in Coldwater, it broke in the saloon. It was a Saturday night, heat hanging thick in the air, when a ranch hand named Eli Carter drank too much whiskey and too little sense. He was young, broad-shouldered, bitter from losing a brother in the war. "They ain't soldiers," Eli slurred, slamming his glass on the counter. "Soldiers bleed, soldiers eat, soldiers die." The barkeep shushed him, glancing nervously toward the door, but Eli only raised his voice. "These bastards march like ghosts, pale as chalk, and that captain of theirs," he spat on the floor, What's he hiding under those damned gloves? The room froze. Because Captain Graves was standing in the doorway. The captain stepped inside, silent as smoke. His coat hung long, his hat brim low, his pale face unreadable. Behind him, 2 soldiers followed, rifles, eyes vacant. Conversations died. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. The piano player lifted his hands and stayed still. Graves crossed the room slow, boots heavy on the boards. He stopped at the bar, one gloved hand resting on the wood. His voice was calm, cold. Repeat yourself. Eli swallowed, liquid courage warring with terror. He spat again, forcing a grin. I said you ain't soldiers. And I said you're hiding something. The captain's head tilted, just so. And you wish to see it? Eli's grin faltered. But pride pushed him forward. He reached out, fast, and grabbed at the black leather glove. The saloon gasped as the glove tore halfway off. For a moment the hand beneath was bare. And what they saw was not a man's hand. The skin was white as bone, stretched tight over sinew. The fingers were long, too long, ending in dark claws instead of nails. The veins beneath the skin pulsed faint, not red, but black. Eli staggered back, face draining of color. Dear God. The captain seized him by the throat with that same hand. He lifted him clear off the ground like he weighed nothing. Eli kicked, choked, clawed at the pale grip crushing his windpipe. The glove slid fully free, dropping to the floor. The town saw it all now. The monstrous hand, the claws, the strength no man should hold. Do you believe now? Graves asked, voice low. Eli gagged, face purple, eyes bulging. Graves turned his head slowly, sweeping the room with those stone-gray eyes. This is the hand that keeps you safe, the hand that guards your homes, the hand that bleeds so you do not. He tightened his grip. Eli's body went limp. Then, with a flick, he tossed the ranch hand across the bar. Eli crashed into bottles, glass shattering, whiskey flooding the floor. The saloon stood frozen, every man and woman staring at the pale, clawed hand now flexing in the lantern light. Graves bent, picked up the fall and glove and slid it back on with deliberate slowness. The leather squeaked faint as it stretched tight. Then he looked at the barkeep. This never happened. The barkeep nodded frantically, eyes wide. Graves turned and walked out, soldiers following in perfect step. The door swung shut, silence held like a noose. They found Eli Carter the next morning in the alley behind the saloon. His body was pale, his neck torn open. The sheriff called it wolves. The townsfolk said nothing, but from then on no one doubted what lay beneath Captain Graves's gloves, and no one ever dared try to tear them off again. By now, Coldwater knew the truth. Or enough of it to keep their heads down. The pale soldiers never ate, never drank, never slept. The drills went on all night, boots pounding like thunder. People vanished without trace, their homes left bloody and empty. And when a ranch hand dared to pull off Captain Graves's glove, the monster beneath had torn his throat out and left him cold in the dust. Still, the town stayed silent, because fear had a way of holding tighter than faith. Until Captain Graves gathered them. It was dusk when the bugle called, not for drills, but for assembly. Every soldier stood in perfect lines along Main Street, rifles gleaming in the dying light. The townsfolk shuffled forward, drawn by command more than choice. The church bell tolled once. Then Graves stepped onto the church porch, pale face glowing against the lantern light, black gloves tight around hands that were no longer a secret. He looked over the crowd like a judge reading a verdict. Mothers clutched children, men clutched hats. No one dared breathe too loud. My name, he said, voice smooth, is Captain Silas Graves. My regiment fought for the Union when this country tore itself apart. We bled at Shiloh, at Vicksburg, at Antietam, and when the world forgot us, still we marched. His eyes narrowed. Because war is never done. The sheriff swallowed. Captain, what war are you fighting now? Graves's lips curved thin. The war against hunger. The war against death. The war that takes all men, but not us. The townsfolk shifted uneasily. You've seen it, Graves continued. Your wells run dry. Your cattle starve. Raiders circle like wolves. You are weak. You are dying. But we are not. He raised one gloved hand. The soldiers behind him stamped their boots once, the sound shaking the street like thunder. We do not tire. We do not hunger. We do not fall. The blacksmith shouted, trembling. Then what are you? Graves's eyes glinted in the firelight. We are eternal. Gasps rippled. Some crossed themselves. Others shook their heads in denial. The captain's voice never wavered. We will protect you. Guard your wells. Keep raiders from your doors. No harm will come to this town while we march its streets. He let the promise hang. Then he spoke the cost. In return, you will feed us. The crowd went still. Food? Someone whispered. Graves's mouth curled into the faintest smile. Not bread, not water, blood. Yours. Your livestock. You're unwanted. You're guilty. Whatever you offer, we will take. A woman screamed. A man cursed. The preacher raised his Bible, shouting, Demon! You will not! He never finished. In a blur, a soldier stepped from the line, pale hand snapping the Bible from his grip, breaking the man's wrist like a twig. The preacher fell screaming in the dust, his words silenced. The captain waited for quiet, then spoke again, calm as ever. This is not cruelty. This is order. You give. We march. You live. The sheriff's voice shook. And if we say no, Graves's gray eyes locked on him. Then you die. All of you. Tonight. The soldiers stamped again, the sound like a drum roll for the gallows. The blacksmith clenched his fists, looking at the preacher writhing in the dust, his face twisted between rage and terror. But when his little girl began to cry in her mother's arms, he lowered his head. Others followed. Hats dipped. Voices hushed. No one spoke again. The captain nodded once, satisfied. Then it is agreed. That night the regiment fed openly. They began with livestock, dragging cattle from pens, holding them down as pale mouths pressed to throats. The animals screamed, then went silent. Then came prisoners. Drifters held in the sheriff's cells, outlaws caught weeks before. Their cries echoed through the street as soldiers carried them into the church basement. None returned. The town shut its doors and lit no lamps. Mothers covered children's ears. Men stared at walls, fists clenched. And above it all, the bugle called again, and the drills resumed. Boots pounded, rifles clattered. Soldiers marched in endless circles under the moon, fed and tireless, their shadows long and sharp. Coldwater survived another night, but survival had been bought, and every soul in town knew the price. Once the pact was made, Coldwater stopped pretending. The cavalry didn't hide their hunger anymore. They didn't whisper or wait for shadows. They fed, and the town let them. It began with livestock. Every week a soldier would step onto a rancher's porch, pale face blank, and point with his rifle. A goat, a calf, a horse. The family would watch in silence as the soldiers dragged the animal away, its cries fading into the church basement. By morning, the pens were emptier, the town's stomachs hollower. But no raiders came, no wolves prowled. The regiment marched, and the town lived. Soon, the livestock wasn't enough. The prisoners came next, outlaws locked in the jailhouse, drifters caught sleeping near the creek, a gambler who refused to pay his debts. They vanished into the basement. Their screams clawed at the floorboards of the saloon above, echoing long into the night. But when the sun rose, Main Street stood quiet. The stores opened. Bread baked. The town pretended nothing had happened, and then the townsfolk themselves began to offer. It was never said aloud, never written, but everywhere. Ni knew. The sick, the old, the unwanted, the useless. They began to disappear. A blind ranch hand, an orphaned boy with no family, a fevered woman with no chance of recovery. Soldiers came for them at night, pale hands gripping shoulders, boots crunching in the dirt. The families did not resist. Sometimes they even left doors unlocked, lamps burning, as if to guide the regiment to the sacrifice. One evening, the blacksmith stood at his door with his crippled brother. The man leaned heavy on a cane, lungs rattling with every breath. He'd been a burden for years, carried on the blacksmith's back when work got too heavy. That night, when the soldiers came, the blacksmith didn't fight. He pressed a kiss to his brother's head and stepped aside. The soldiers took him without a word. The blacksmith shut the door. His wife wept in silence. His daughter watched with wide eyes and said nothing. The next morning, the forge still burned, bread still baked, the regiment still drilled, and the town lived. But the drills were worse now. Fed and tireless, the soldiers marched with a frenzy that rattled windows. Boots pounded, rifles clattered, voices barked commands that echoed like thunder. It no longer sounded like practice. It sounded like war. Children woke screaming. Mothers stuffed rags under doors to muffle the noise. Men clenched fists, whispering that no war drums had ever sounded so loud. But still, the town stayed silent, because silence kept them alive. Until one man tried to break it. The barkeep, who'd watched too many vanish, slammed a bottle on his counter and spat. "We ain't a town no more. We're a herd." The blacksmith hissed at him. "Quiet." But the barkeep kept going. "You all see it. We're cattle to 'em. They bleed us dry and march in circles like ghosts, and we—" The saloon doors creaked open. 2 soldiers stood there. Pale faces, blank eyes, rifles resting ease. The barkeep froze. Sweat ran down his temple. The blacksmith whispered, "Sit down." The barkeep sank slowly onto his stool, eyes wide, mouth clamped shut. The soldiers didn't move. They just stood in the doorway, watching. Then, as if they'd heard what they needed, they turned and left. The barkeep never spoke again. The regiment's feeding became rhythm. Every week a goat, every month a prisoner, every season a townsman. And with each sacrifice, the town's silence grew heavier. But some noticed things. The soldiers never touched bread, never drank water, never sat in sunlight. And when they drilled at night, their movements were too sharp, too fast, too perfect. It wasn't practice. It was hunger marching. Hunger that would never end. By autumn, Coldwater had gone quiet. The stores still opened, bread still baked, but laughter was gone. Children played only indoors. Men no longer argued at the saloon. They drank in silence. And when night fell, every lamp went out. The town lived, but only because the regiment fed. And still, that wasn't living. One night, 3 families gathered in the blacksmith's barn. Their faces were pale, eyes hollow, voices whispers. "We can't stay," one man hissed. "They'll bleed us all dry. You've seen it. The cattle, the prisoners, now our own. How long before they come for our children?" The others nodded, though fear made their hands shake. "We ride tonight," another whispered. "Before the bugle sounds, east toward Santa Fe. It's a week's ride, but better a chance on the road than certain death here." The blacksmith clenched his fists. He thought of his brother, carried off months ago. He thought of his little girl, hiding behind her mother's skirt when the soldiers marched past. His voice broke. "If we run fast. They can't follow forever." But even as he said it, his words rang hollow. They saddled horses in silence, moving like thieves in their own barns. They tied bedrolls, packed what food was left, kissed children's foreheads, and prayed. By midnight, 12 souls rode east into the desert, hooves muffled under cloth. For the first time in months, the town slept without knowing, and for a few hours the riders believed they might be free. Then the bugle sounded. A single note, long and piercing, split the night behind them. The families froze in their saddles. The children whimpered. The blacksmith's wife whispered, "God help us." Hoofbeats thundered in the distance, not the uneven rhythm of desperate escape, the perfect pounding cadence of soldiers. The regiment came like a storm, 20 riders in perfect formation, rifles gleaming in moonlight, pale faces blank. Their horses moved too fast, too smooth, hooves barely striking dust. The families spurred their mounts, desperation breaking into panic, but the cavalry gained ground with every stride. The blacksmith turned in his saddle, heart hammering. He saw Captain Graves at their head, hat low, coat long, eyes glowing faint in the dark, his gloved hand raised, and the soldiers fanned wide, encircling the fugitives like wolves around deer. The first shot cracked the air. A man screamed, falling from his horse. His wife tried to turn back, but a pale rider seized her reins, dragging her into the dark. Children wailed. Mothers begged. The desert filled with terror. The blacksmith roared, swinging his hammer at a soldier who rode too close. It struck the rider's chest with a sound like stone, but the pale soldier didn't fall. He seized the hammer and snapped the wooden handle in two, tossing it aside like kindling. The blacksmith's daughter screamed as another rider grabbed her. He fought like a wild animal, fists breaking against pale jaws that didn't bleed. But one by one, the families were dragged from their horses. By dawn, the desert was silent again. The sun rose over broken wagons, blood-stained sand, and hoofprey. Ints circling like ritual. The families never returned. Only their horses staggered back to Coldwater, reins torn, eyes wild. The town saw the truth. There was no escape. That night, the drills were louder than ever. Boots pounded, rifles clattered, voices barked. The soldiers marched in perfect unison, pale faces glowing in torchlight, eyes cold and empty. And the town lay awake, knowing the war wasn't over, because the regiment had shown them what happened to deserters. And the lesson was clear. You didn't leave Coldwater. Coldwater left you. Coldwater awoke to silence, the kind of silence that makes you afraid to open a door. Then someone screamed. The townsfolk poured into Main Street, blinking in the harsh morning light. And there they saw what the regiment had left behind. 6 men hung from the church rafters, necks broken, bodies pale. 4 women lay at the base of the steps, sprawled in the dust, throats torn open. And 3 children, God help them, sat propped against the church wall, faces blank, eyes wide, not a drop of blood left in them. Their horses had been tied neatly at the hitching posts, reins coiled, as if they'd been returned like borrowed tools. The message was clear. Gasps filled the air. Mothers covered children's eyes. Men clenched fists and swallowed hard. The sheriff tried to speak, but his voice cracked. They wanted us to see. No one answered. The regiment had not hidden their cruelty. They had staged it, displayed it, turned it into law. And every soul in town understood. There was no running. By noon, Captain Graves appeared. He stood in front of the church, pale face calm, black gloves gleaming. His soldiers flanked him, rifles balanced in perfect stillness. "Last night," he said, voice carrying down the street, "some of you broke faith." His eyes swept the crowd. "You believed you could abandon your duty. Leave this place. Leave us." He paused. His gloved hand tightened on his belt. "This town lives because of us, and it will die if you forget it." He turned slightly, gesturing at the bodies who hung and sprawled before the church. "This is justice. This is discipline. This is what happens when loyalty breaks." The preacher, his wrist still bound from where the soldiers had snapped it weeks earlier, whispered hoarsely, "This is not justice. This is butchery." The captain's gray eyes slid to him. The soldiers stamped their boots once, the sound like thunder. The preacher went silent. The townsfolk lowered their heads. They couldn't meet the captain's stare. They couldn't look at the bodies either. They just stood in silence, letting the law of the regiment burn itself into their memory. Graves nodded once. You will not speak of this again. You will not question. You will not run. He raised one gloved hand. The soldiers stamped again, rifles snapping to shoulders in unison. Then he spoke the words that sealed Coldwater's fate. You belong to us now. That night the drills were louder than ever. The bugle blared, boots pounded, rifles clattered, voices barked commands in the dark. The sound was no longer just practice, it was triumph. The regiment had fed. The regiment had punished. The regiment had claimed the town, and in every home, families lay awake, staring at walls, whispering only one thing in their hearts. Coldwater wasn't a town anymore. It was a garrison for soldiers who should have died, soldiers who would never stop marching. Coldwater had seen enough to know the truth, but no one dared to say it. The regiment wasn't human. The pact wasn't protection. And their captain wasn't a man of law. But the people still kept their heads down, still baked their bread, still drew their water. Because silence meant life. Until the night Captain Graves chose to end the silence. It was harvest's end, the air sharp with dust. The regiment called another assembly at dusk. The bugle blared and the townsfolk gathered in front of the church once more. Thor came without protest, shoulders bowed, eyes down. The soldiers lined the street, pale faces blank, rifles gleaming in torchlight. Their boots were stained dark from drills that had gone on for hours, as though they'd been preparing for something. And then Graves stepped forward. His coat was buttoned, his hat brim low, black gloves tight across his hands. But something was different. The crowd could feel it. His voice, when it came, was colder than before. You still cling to hope. The crowd shifted uneasily. You tell yourselves this is temporary, that we will march away, that you will wake one morning and the drills will stop. His eyes swept the gathering, sharp as knives. There is no leaving. There is no dawn without us. We are the dawn. The sheriff, trembling, forced himself forward. His voice cracked. Captain, whatever you are, you ain't law, you ain't union, you ain't justice. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The sheriff's wife clutched her child to her skirts. For a moment, silence held. Then Graves raised a gloved hand. The soldiers stamped once, thunder shaking the boards. Graves's lips curved thin. You want truth? Then see it. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled the glove from his left hand. The pale, skeletal claws gleamed in the torchlight, long and sharp, veins pulsing black. The townsfolk gasped. Some stumbled back. Mothers screamed. He dropped the glove into the dust and tugged the other free, both hands now bare, both monstrous, both proof of what they'd feared. Then he lifted his hat. For the first time, the town saw his face clearly. The pale skin stretched tight across cheekbones, the eyes glowing faint red. The teeth, fangs long and sharp, catching the firelight as he smiled. Gasps turned to screams. The sheriff staggered back, hand on his revolver, though he knew bullets had never worked. Graves spread his arms wide, monstrous hands gleaming, fangs bared. His voice thundered. We are not men. We are not bound by your laws or your God. We are soldiers of eternity. We are your law now. The soldiers stamped in unison, rifles raised, eyes burning red in the night. The sound rattled windows, shook the ground, turned the air to thunder. The townsfolk dropped to their knees, some sobbing, some praying, most too terrified to move. The sheriff drew his revolver, pointing it with shaking hands. If you ain't law, then I'll end you. Graves didn't flinch. He only smiled wider. The shot rang out, echoing through the desert. The bullet struck the captain square in the chest. His coat snapped back, pale flesh tearing, and then the wound closed before their eyes. Gasps, sobs, silence. Graves stepped forward, boots heavy in the dust. His monstrous hand gripped the sheriff's throat. He lifted him like a rag doll, revolver falling uselessly to the ground. The sheriff kicked and gagged, face purple, hands clawing at the pale grip. Graves leaned close, voice low enough for the crowd to strain to hear. You see now, you are mine. Then he tossed the sheriff into the street. The man lay gasping, broken, but alive. The message was clear. The regiment stamped again, rifles clattering, voices barking commands that echoed like war cries. The town fell to its knees, heads bowed, voices trembling with prayers that went unheard. And Captain Graves stood in the firelight, gloves discarded, fangs bared, eyes burning red. The mask was gone. The truth was revealed. And Coldwater knew their commander was not a man of war. He was a monster, and the war had never ended. It had only changed sides. Coldwater had seen the mask drop. They knew now what marched their streets. Not men, not soldiers, but pale, ageless monsters in ragged uniforms. And though fear kept most on their knees, a few souls still believed they could fight, because when you've lost everything, even fear can feel lighter than silence. It began with the blacksmith. He had given his crippled broth, heir to the regiment months before. He had watched them take prisoners, cattle, even children. And when he saw Captain Graves lift the sheriff by the throat and heal from a bullet in the same breath, something inside him broke. "This ain't living," he whispered to the barkeep that night. "If I'm gonna die, better with a hammer in my hand than a rope round my neck." The barkeep stared into his whiskey, then nodded. "I'll help." By morning, there were 7 of them: the blacksmith, the barkeep, 2 ranchers who'd lost sons, a widow whose daughter had vanished, and 2 boys just old enough to grow whiskers, but too angry to stay quiet. They met in the church basement when the regiment drilled outside. The pounding boots above shook the rafters, dust raining down as they whispered plans. "We set fire to their barracks," the blacksmith said. "Trap them inside. Fire don't care how strong a man is." "They're not men," the widow muttered, "but maybe fire still burns." The barkeep poured kerosene into bottles, stuffing rags into their necks. "Then we give 'em hell." That night, while the regiment drilled on Main Street, the 7 rebels crept toward the wooden barracks at the edge of town. The desert wind carried the sound of boots and bugles, masking their footsteps. They doused the walls with kerosene, the sharp smell filling the air. The widow struck a match with trembling hands. The flame danced, small but hungry. "For my girl," she whispered, and threw it. The fire caught fast, racing up the walls, licking the roof. Flames roared, smoke billowed, sparks leapt into the night sky. The townsfolk watching from their porches held their breath. For a moment they dared to hope. Maybe fire would end it. Maybe this nightmare could finally burn away. Then the barracks doors burst open. The regiment marched out through the fire. Their uniforms smoked. Their pale skin glowed orange in the flames. But they did not burn. Not one screamed. Not one stumbled. They walked in perfect, cheat step, rifles gleaming, eyes red in the firelight. The crowd gasped, children cried, men dropped to their knees. The rebels froze in horror as the regiment spread into the street, unscathed. And at their head was Captain Graves. His coat smoldered, but his face was calm. His gloves were gone. His claws gleamed in the torchlight. "You think fire will break us?" His voice carried like thunder. "We were born in fire. We are fire." The soldiers moved as one. In seconds, the rebels were seized. The blacksmith swung his hammer wildly, striking a soldier's skull. The pale man didn't flinch. He wrenched the hammer free and drove it through the blacksmith's chest. The widow screamed as claws sank into her shoulders, dragging her into the ranks. The boys fought, fists flailing, but pale jaws snapped at their throats and silenced them. Only the barkeep was left, clutching one last bottle of fire. He lit the rag, hand shaking, eyes wide. "For God's sake!" The captain's hand shot forward, claws piercing his chest. The bottle slipped, flame spilling, and the barkeep collapsed in the dust. The fire died with him. By dawn, the ashes of the barracks smoldered, but the regiment drilled as always. Boots pounded, rifles clattered, voices barked in unison. And the 7 rebels? Their bodies hung from the water tower, pale and drained, turning slowly in the desert wind. The townsfolk gathered in silence. Mothers wept. Fathers clenched their fists, but none spoke, none dared. Because the lesson was clear. You could not fight the regiment. You could not burn them. You could not kill them. and if you tried, you'd only feed them more. That night, as the drills thundered louder than ever, the people of Coldwater whispered the truth they'd been too afraid to say aloud. The war was over, but for these soldiers, war was all that remained, and Coldwater was their battlefield now. After the rebel, Ion burned to ash, Coldwater no longer pretended. The 7 who dared fight were left hanging for a week, their pale faces turned toward the town, eyes open, bodies drained. Each morning the soldiers marched past them in formation, boots pounding, rifles gleaming. Each night the bugle called, and the drills echoed beneath their corpses swaying in the wind. The message was carved into the marrow of every soul. There was no fire strong enough, no courage sharp enough, no weapon hard enough. Coldwater belonged to the regiment, but Captain Graves knew fear alone was not enough. Fear fades. Fear grows dull. Fear needs sharpening. And so, one evening at dusk, he gathered the town again. The soldiers lined Main Street in silence, eyes glowing faint in the torchlight. Graves stepped forward, coat long, gloves gone, claws bare for all to see. His pale face caught the fire, and when he smiled, the town shuddered. "You've seen what happens when loyalty breaks," he said, voice steady, cold. "Now you will learn what it means to keep faith." He raised a clawed hand. 2 soldiers dragged a prisoner from the jailhouse, a drifter caught on the road days before. The man kicked, begged, cursed, but the soldiers gripped him like stone. Graves turned to the crowd. "From this night forward, you will give us one, each month, one of yours, chosen by you, offered freely, for if you do not choose, we will choose for you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mothers clutched children. Men shook their heads in disbelief. The preacher, wrist-bound, voice hoarse, whispered, "This is murder." Graves's eyes snapped to him. "This is survival, yours and ours." He turned, gesturing to the prisoner. The soldiers pulled him onto the church steps. Graves stepped close, baring his fangs. The drifter screamed as pale jaws sank into his throat. Blood spilled down Graves's coat as he drank, slow, deliberate, the sound carrying through the silent street. When he dropped the body, pale and limp. The soldiers stamped once. Graves wiped his mouth with the back of his clawed hand. His voice was calm again. "This is the law." That night the townsfolk whispered behind shuttered doors. The widow clutched her child. "Who will it be? Which family? Which name?" The blacksmith's wife sobbed. "If we give one, maybe the rest of us live. Maybe that's mercy." The sheriff sat alone, revolver on the table, knowing bullets would never work. His hand trembled as he stared at it, wondering if death by his own hand would be kinder than waiting for the captain to choose. The next month, the town gathered again. The soldiers stood in their line, the bugle called, the torches burned, and the townsfolk stepped forward with a name. A fevered old rancher, half mad, coughing blood. The soldiers took him without struggle. The month after, it was an orphan boy, no family to claim him. The month after that, a woman too weak to walk, her husband weeping as he handed her over. Each time the regiment fed. Each time the drills grew louder, sharper, faster. The soldiers' boots thundered as though their hunger itself was marching through the dust. Soon it became ritual. Every 4 weeks, the town gathered on Main Street. A name was given. A sacrifice was offered. The soldiers fed, the regiment drilled, and Coldwater survived another month. But survival had changed. It wasn't bread. It wasn't water. It was blood.